Hey, I'm Damon Garcia, bringing you perspectives from the Christian left, and today we're going through Christian history again, continuing our journey through Socialism and the Churches by Rosa Luxemburg, and she helps us understand how churches started as these communities which shared everything, turned into feudal overlords, and then became a capitalist business. Let's get into it. Like I said, we're going through this document, Socialism and the Churches, written in 1905. You need to go watch the other 4 parts first. This is part 5. The link is in the description for the other ones. So, we've been going through the history of the church, how it started, how it came to be what it is. And we talked last video how just through very practical steps, it went from a community that shared everything and had the top priority being caring for the poor to a business that just totally oppressed the poor. And we stopped around the 13th century, so let's keep going. Thus were the relations between the church and the people modified with the passage of time. Christianity began, by the way, as we read this, remember Rosa Luxemburg is a Jewish atheist. And even she sees what we're about to say. She's not approaching this like, yo, Christianity, all these churches have done all this oppression, therefore get rid of the church. No, she's approaching it like, here's what the original message was when we read the Bible, and here's where it went wrong. Church leaders, please remember your original calling. So let's continue. Christianity began as a message of consolation to the disinherited and the wretched. It brought a doctrine which combated social inequality and the antagonism between rich and poor. It taught the community of riches. Soon, this temple of equality and fraternity became a new source of social antagonisms. Having given up the struggle against individual property, which was formerly carried on by the early apostles, the clergy itself gathered riches together. It allied itself with the possessing classes who lived by exploiting the labor of the toiling class. In feudal times, the church belonged to the nobility, the ruling class, and fiercely defended the power of the latter against the revolution. At the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, the people of Central Europe swept away serfdom and the privileges of the nobility. At that time, the church allied itself afresh with the dominant classes. So as feudalism ended and capitalism began, church made sure it still stayed tight with the higher classes. So it went from allying itself with the nobility class to now allying itself with the industrial and commercial bourgeoisie. Today, the situation has changed and the clergy no longer possess great estates, but they own capital which they try to make productive by the exploitation of the people through commerce and industry, as do the capitalists. The Catholic Church in Austria possessed, according to its own statistics, a capital of more than 813 million crowns, of which 300 million were in arable lands and in property, 387 million of debentures, and further it lent at interest the sum of 70 million to factory owners and businessmen. And that is how the Church, adapting itself to modern times, changed itself into an industrial and commercial capitalist from being a feudal overlord. As formerly, it continues to collaborate with the class which enriches itself at the expense of the rural proletariat. And I just want to point out here, yes, we're going through the history of when the church had tremendous power, and yet when we look in America and in Europe too today, every day we're seeing the church have less and less power and relevance. And I think the reason is because it chose to become an industrial, commercial, capitalist business, and when that's what you become, your survival depends on the market. And as we became an increasingly secularized society, it no longer felt like we're obligated to go to church, but it felt like a choice among all the people, which now it's like less and less people, part of the market, want anything to do with the church. That's why America is filled all over the country with empty church buildings. The business is now failing. It's falling apart. That's how it is today. And before we continue, I just want to make clear that I think this could be a good thing. Not because I hate the church and want to see it fall. I know some people are like that, like, yeah, churches are failing, people are leaving church, end of Christianity. No. I think it could be a good thing, though, just from the fact that we're people who believe in death and resurrection. But in order to get to resurrection, you got to get to death. And I believe by witnessing the fall of this version of Christianity that we're currently in, that means we can open ourselves up to something new. Open ourselves up to a new kind of Christianity that hopefully is more like the radical Christianity that Jesus led and taught. But several people won't realize that we need to completely restructure the whole thing until they see the death of the whole thing. Let's continue. Here's where things get really sad. Talking about convents. This change is even more striking in the organization of convents. In certain countries, such as Germany and Russia, the Catholic cloisters have been suppressed for a long time. But where they still exist, in France, Italy, and Spain, all evidence points how enormous is the part played by the church and the capitalist regime. In the Middle Ages, the convents were the refuge of the people. It was there that they sought shelter from the severity of lords and princes. It was there that they found food and protection in case of extreme poverty. The cloisters did not refuse bread and nourishment to the hungry. Let us not forget, especially that the Middle Ages knew nothing of the commerce such as is usual in our days. Every farm, every convent produced an abundance for itself, thanks to the labor of the serfs and the craftsmen. Often, the provisions in reserve found no outlet. When they had produced more corn, more vegetables, more wood than was needed for the consumption of the monks, the excess had no value. There was no buyer for it, and not all products could be preserved. In these conditions, the convents freely looked after their poor, in any case offering them only a small part of what has been extracted from their serfs. This was the usual custom in this period, and nearly every farm belonging to the nobility acted similarly. In fact, the cloisters profited considerably from this benevolence. Having the reputation of opening their doors to the poor, they received large gifts and legacies from the rich and powerful. Charity. With the appearance of capitalism and production for exchange, every object acquired a price and became exchangeable. At this moment, the convents, the houses of the lords, and the ecclesiastics ceased their benefactions. The people found no refuge anywhere. Here is one reason, among others, why at the beginning of capitalism in the 18th century, when the workers were not yet organized to defend their interests, there appeared poverty so appalling that humanity seemed to have gone back to the days of the decades of the Roman Empire. But while the Catholic Church in former times undertook to bring help to the Roman proletariat by the preaching of communism, equality, and fraternity, in the capitalist period, it acted in a wholly different fashion. It sought above all to profit from the poverty of the people, to put cheap labor to work. The convents became literally hells of capitalist exploitation. All the worse because they took in the labor of women and children. The law case against the convent of the Good Shepherd in France in 1903 gave a resounding example of these abuses. Little girls, 12, 10, and 9 years old, were compelled to work in abominable conditions, without rest, ruining their eyes and their health, and were badly nourished and subjected to prison discipline. In convents that started out as a refuge for people. At present, the convents are almost entirely suppressed in France, and the church loses the opportunity of direct capitalist exploitation. The tithe, the scourge of the serfs, has likewise long since been abolished. This does not stop the clergy from extorting money from the working class by other methods, and particularly through masses, marriages, burials, and baptisms. And the governments which support the clergy compel the people to pay their tribute. Further, in all countries except the USA and Switzerland, where religion is a personal matter, the church draws from the state enormous sums which obviously come from the hard labor of the people. For instance, in France, the expenditure of the clergy amounts to 40 million francs a year. Yeah, so that's how it was at certain points in several countries. The church would not only get money directly from the people, but would also get money from the government that was just taxes from the people. She goes on, to sum it up, It is the labor of millions of exploited people which assures the existence of the church, the government, and the capitalist class. The statistics concerning the revenue of the church in Austria give an idea of the considerable wealth of the church, which was formerly the refuge of the poor. 5 years ago, that is in 1900, its annual revenues amounted to 60 million crowns and its expenditure did not exceed 35 million. Thus, in the course of a single year, it put aside 25 million at the cost of the sweat and blood shed by the workers. Here are a few details about that sum. The Archbishopric of Vienna, with an annual revenue of 300,000 crowns and the expenses of which were not more than half of that sum, made 150,000 crowns of savings a year. The fixed capital of the Archbishopric amounts to about 7 million crowns. The Archbishopric of Prague enjoys an income of over 500,000 and has about 300,000 in expenses. Its capital reaches nearly 11 million crowns. The Archbishopric of Olmütz has over 500,000 in revenue and about 400,000 in expenses. Its fortune exceeds 14 million. The subordinate clergy, which so often pleads poverty, exploits the population no less. The annual income of the parish priests of Austria reach more than 35 million crowns. The expenses 21 million only, with the result that the savings of the persons yearly reach 14 million. The parish properties make over 450 million. Finally, the convents of 5 years ago possessed, with all expenses deducted, a net revenue of 5 million a year. These riches grew every year, while the poverty of the toilers exploited by capitalism by the state grew from year to year. In our country and everywhere else, the state of things is exactly as in Austria. So that's the end of part 5. That last paragraph probably was over a lot of people's head because she's talking about the economy of Austria in the early 1900s. But basically, she's just saying, yo, the church, super rich and not helping the poor people. And they're rich from exploiting poor people. And like we said in the last video, it's like they didn't just start as a community that shared everything in common and lived in equality, and then some bad apples came and said, we're gonna make this something else and use it to oppress people. No, it was through very practical, small steps over time that ended up becoming this as they grew larger and larger. And this is also something that the Protestants had a problem with the entire Catholic Church, and was one of the reasons for the whole Protestant Reformation. They saw that the church was continuously taking advantage of the poor and making people more and more poor through things such as indulgences as well, of telling people, no, pay us more and more and more in order to guarantee you and your family go to heaven. Ridiculous. And so the Protestants, which isn't a large, huge church like the Catholic Church, it's just millions of independent churches, so no Protestant group ever really had enough power to do this kind of exploitation. But I'm not going to let them off the hook completely, because at the same time, several Protestants kind of just was okay with it, was silent about it, was on the side of the oppressor instead of the oppressed, preach sermons that tell people, just accept your lot, be humble, don't rebel, don't go on strikes, don't protest. It's the bad people who protest. And like I said in our first video, say things like, when a shooting happens of a person of color, make sure everyone prays for the police. So, as I've been saying throughout this series, we need a complete revolution of values. And when I say we, I mean Christians. We need to own up to our mistakes, come to terms with our history, and look back at the radical faith that Jesus taught people to have. Look at the radical way that the original apostles lived and ran the early church. And of course we can't go backwards, but we can learn from our mistakes and learn from people who were doing some things right and had good ideas, and really try to change the whole thing. Instead of just being humble and backing off and saying, oh, that's just how it is. That's not what Christians are or should be. Christians are called to have radical faith that will change the whole world. That's who we're supposed to be. This idea that Christians are on the side of the powers that be, of the status quo, that's not the type of Christianity that Jesus began. No way. No way. Christians, by being Christian, should always be on the side of the revolution, should always be on the side of those who are trying to change a system that oppresses others. And if that sounds like a lot, that's why we're called to have faith. So, that's part 5 of Socialism in the Churches. That's kind of the end of the Christian history bit. And part 6, Rosa is going to start talking about the goal of the socialists of her time and in her area. So, make sure you watch the next video too. So I'll see you over there. Thank you, Rosa, and thank you all for watching.